Finally, he excitedly brought Moser to a remote plot. Moser was astounded, for Ed had unerringly located the worst acre in the state. It was all bedrock, right up to the surface. You couldn't plow it, you couldn't farm it. Moser gladly gave a small section to his friend. A few weeks later, Moser's curiosity got the better of him. He dragged his wife out through the brush to see what Ed could possibly do with that land. They couldn't believe their eyes. Ed had somehow cut a 10-ton block of solid coral right out of the bedrock and hoisted it into the air. As they nervously approached his flimsy tripod and the block which could crush them in an instant, they realized there was something more than craziness in Ed. How did he do it? Ed smiled and said, "It's not difficult, really. The secret is in knowing how." Why did he do it? He smiled again. "Someday, my sweet 16 will come." Working alone, he cut more blocks. All the locals had to visit and gape at this accomplishment. Ed was friendly, but firm. He would never tell his secret techniques, and he would always stop work when people came near. Trying to catch him at work, the neighbors took to spying. Some people swear they saw the rocks move. Ed could somehow sense their inquiring gaze. He would simply stop working and patiently wait until they gave up trying to discover his secrets. "60 years later, the completed coral castle still embodies a number of unsolved mysteries. Francis Wilson.
This block weighs 9 tons. It's just one piece of rock. See what you can do with one hand?
He's quite interested in safety, I know that, and he always wanted to make sure that children couldn't get down in here, and that was his gate to keep children from going down the steps.
Those who knew Ed remember him with great respect. Charles Williams and Bodil Lowe.
I guess I was maybe 6, 7 years old. I was born and raised about 300 yards from this place, and I would see Ed quite often at the little country store we had, and he was a very slight man. I don't think he was probably any taller than I am. I'm about 5'6". Probably weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 pounds. He always looked frail and sickly, but obviously very strong.
He'd say this is because of the stars and the moon, and he would go on and he would show us his electrical machine. Now he made electricity, and he would jump in his bathtub and show how the water would come to certain levels and how he heated it with the sun. And he'd always divert your question.
As I say, a very gentle, kind person. And he was, of course, highly intelligent. Many people thought he was a little cracked because he was smarter, I think, than they were, probably.
His whole life and whole being was very frugal. Just sustained himself, I think, more or less.
And some nights we'd come in the moonlight and sit and walk around in his park. And he would come out and tell us his story if he had a small audience. And he would go along in a very normal sort of a voice, and then we'd ask him why he did it. And they'd say, "Oh, well, someday my sweet 16 is coming," and he'd look up in the stars, and he would get very ethereal in his voice, and he just loved talking about his sweet 16.
And he always spoke of her as sweet 16. She never grew any older. It's kind of nice.
There were many rumors about mysterious Ed. One held that he was an eccentric miser and kept a stash of money. Late one evening in the 1930s, a band of toughs waited until he was alone in Coral Castle. Little Ed could never have imagined such a shocking intrusion into his private world. The attack prompted the most extraordinary feat of his life. Coral Castle was originally built in a remote area of Florida. For years, Ed Leedskalnin felt safe in isolation, away from the harsh realities of the cities. He had carved this place with his bare hands as a Shangri-La for his sweet 16. Barely surviving a brutal robbery, however, Ed decided to seek safer ground. When he moved, Ed took more than his toothbrush. He took Coral Castle itself. He hired a local truck owner and with characteristic secrecy, politely asked the man to step around the corner. The truck would be loaded in just a minute. Piece by piece, Ed moved all 3 million pounds of rock 10 miles to its present location near Homestead, Florida. As usual, no one ever managed to see how he lifted the giant rocks, which weighed up to 30 tons apiece. How did he do it? There are many theories. 60 million years ago, this was all of South Florida. Thousands of miles of living coral reef. The rock which he used, fossil coral, may have internal forces which only Ed understood. A huge brain coral seems almost conscious, perhaps contemplating ancient secrets. Living coral constructs its own undersea castles. Forces deep in the earth fuse dead coral into oolite, a dense, strong organic rock. And most of South Florida has little topsoil over this bedrock. We asked the men at a rock quarry to try an experiment, to cut and lift a giant block of oolite. With diamond-tipped power saws, the cutting alone took several hours. The only way to break the block free, brute force.